After the battle, the general-in-chief went to sleep at Nazareth. This small place is situated a good way within the mountains in a very picturesque situation, between two groves, one of sycamore and the other of date trees. The chief part of the inhabitants are Christians. Before Bonaparte entered the village, he stopped near an ancient fountain where a considerable number of cattle were drinking. The elders of the village stood there waiting for the general-in-chief. The whole scene recalled to memory the patriarchal times so beautifully described in the Bible. The French were received with great demonstrations of joy, and General Bonaparte went with his staff to pass the night at the convent of Nazareth. This convent was evidently built in the time of the Crusades. The edifice is not very large. Next morning, the general-in-chief asked the superior to conduct him to the church, which resembles our village churches and contains nothing remarkable but the chapel, which was once, they say, the bedchamber for the Virgin Mary. It is below the chief altar, and a few very broad steps descend to it. An altar fills the space of the bed, and being cut out of the rock, it is no more than 7 feet in height. The superior, who was a Spaniard but spoke very good Italian, made us observe on the left side of the altar a pillar of black marble, the shaft of which touched the ceiling, while its basement was broken off some feet from the ground, which made it appear suspended. The prior told us in the gravest manner possible that when the angel Gabriel came to announce the Virgin her glorious and holy destination, he touched the pillar with his heel and broke it in two. We burst out a-laughing, but General Bonaparte looked severely at us and made us resume our gravity. Along the cloisters were lying about 30 men who had been wounded on the preceding day. Several of them had just expired, and these latter had nearly all received from the monks the last comforts of religion. This was probably done at the instigation of these pious Cenobites, for at that period the French troops were very foreign to any religious feeling. Neither the aspect of the country wherein they fought, nor the names of most of those places, which had been familiar to them during the infancy, nearly all of them being born between the years 1775 and 1780, seemed capable of recalling to their memory the sentiments and recollections of their youth. At Nazareth, we lost a man who had been most useful to General Bonaparte and the army, namely Monsieur Venture, first interpreter to the general-in-chief. This old man had passed all his life in the East, and his wandering life had produced a strange mixture of nations in his family, his wife being Greek, his daughter an Egyptian, and his son-in-law a Pole. He was very much regretted, but his place was adequately filled by Monsieur Joubert, his pupil, who, notwithstanding his numerous and perilous voyages, still lives for his friends and the sciences. We returned to St. John of Acre, and on our arrival before the town, the general-in-chief finally learned that Rear Admiral Duperrey had put on shore 3 24 and 6 18-pounders, and the necessary ammunition. The works of the mine were continued, and on the 5th Floréal, it was decided to spring it. All the batteries began to play upon the enemy in order to deceive him, and fire was set to the mine, but a vault that existed in the tower presented a line of sight resistance. One side only was destroyed. It remained, however, in a state of breach. This breach was as difficult to reach as it had been before. We were therefore obliged to begin battering afresh the curtain and the tower. The attack of the 6th was more murderous than the former, and still without success. 400 men remained during 6 hours in the breach that looked toward the ditch. The enemy, posted on the reverse, continued throwing incessantly burning projectiles into the midst of that mass of men who were unable to advance and still would not consent to go down. At last, the break of day rendered visible the most horrible disorder and a position which could not possibly be maintained. we were again obliged to abandon the tower. We had lost an enormous number of officers, especially among the engineers. General Caffarelli, who had commanded the engineers, showed some signs of recovery, but he every day asked why his comrades came no longer to see him. Though the utmost care was taken to conceal from him the fatal news of their death, grief and anxiety augmented his sufferings. He sometimes said to me, "It was I who seduced, I who led on all those hopeful young men. Alas, that they should have fallen before such a wretched fortress." Finally, the death of young Say, the chief of his staff, which could not be kept a secret from him, threw him into a deep melancholy, and he died soon after. He was not regretted by the army alone. To extensive information, Caffarelli added great feeling and a mildness of disposition that will make his memory dear to all those who knew him. He would certainly have acted a very important part under the empire, for General Bonaparte had great esteem and consideration for him. The army had already stormed the city 12 times and withstood 26 sorties when General Kleber and his division were recalled to the camp. A new mine had been opened, and we were already on the point of charging it when the enemy once more gave vent to it. Notwithstanding all our efforts, he reached the branch, so that we were obliged to make our miners retire precipitately out of the mine and to stop it up by explosion. The circumstance was the more fatal, as by it we lost all hope of making ourselves masters of the town by that means. We had to return to cannonading, which also speedily relaxed, the gunpowder we expected from Gaza not having arrived. On the next day, however, we received a sufficient quantity. The courage of the soldiers increased, and when they heard that the division of Kleber was coming, the whole camp went to meet it, with congratulations and prophecies that the honor of taking the town would belong to the newcomers. The batteries had destroyed a great part of the curtain, which presented a space wide enough to mount for an assault. The grenadiers of Kleber's division received that honorable, though perilous, commission. But just as they were descending into the ditch in order to cross it, the enemy opened on their flank a tremendous fire from the two sides. The grenadiers, however, penetrated into the town. But when there, they were fired upon from all sides of a large square and from the palace of the Djezar. The difficulty of climbing up the breach prevented our soldiers from rushing easily into this new circle. The bravest among them were killed. The rest hesitated. It became necessary to lead the troops back into the trenches. The general-in-chief could not resolve to order the 14th assault, but the grenadiers and most of the officers who had already been in the town insisted in so pressing a manner for leave to go up once more that the general-in-chief, after having got the breach widened, let them advance again. General Kleber placed himself on the reverse of the fosse, where, sword in hand, he animated his troops with his stentorian voice amidst the dead and the dying. On looking on that gigantic figure, a whole head taller than the rest of the soldiers, one might have taken him for one of the heroes of Homer. The noise and smoke of the cannon, the cries of the soldiers, the roaring of the Turks, our troops rushing on the enemy made our hearts beat with enthusiasm. Nobody doubted but the town would be taken. But suddenly the column stopped. General Bonaparte had placed himself in the breach battery to examine once more the movements of the army. He had fixed his glass between the fascines of the battery when a ball from the town struck the superior fascine, and the general-chief fell into the arms of General Berthier. We thought him killed, but fortunately he had not been touched. His fall was only an effect of the commotion of the air. In vain, General Berthier pressed him to retire. He received one of those harsh and dry replies, after which no one dare insist. While we were examining the singular absence of all motion on the part of the troops, a bullet entered the head of young Arrighi, who was standing between the general-in-chief and me. Some others were killed afterwards, General Bonaparte still refusing to retire. At last we learned what was the obstacle that prevented the troops from advancing. In the interval between the two assaults, the enemy had filled up a wide ditch with all sorts of inflammable matter, so that repeated and terrible explosions killed all those that came near it. It was too broad to be crossed. There were no means of turning it, and our soldiers stood before that insurmountable obstacle, enraged at not being able to advance, and still resolved not to go back. Several generals were wounded and a great number of officers and soldiers killed. We lost the general of division, Bonne, the adjutant general, Foulet, and Crossier, aide-de-camp to the general chief. To continue the siege would have been paying too dearly for the conquest of a city already ravaged by the plague. The disease had been brought to the camp by the 2nd Light Demi-Brigade that had caught it at Damietta. The army had also found it at Jaffa, and though it was not marked here by those terrible symptoms, it had shown at Alexandria, and went under the name of a benign plague. It still swept away many victims, and would undoubtedly have cost us more men still if we had taken St. John of Acre. General Bonaparte felt convinced that that fever was really the plague. The physician-in-chief, Desgenets, alleged, on the contrary, that it was nothing more than a common fever. His opinion and argument served to tranquilize the soldiers, but they had one bad effect, that of disposing them to neglect the caution necessary in all contagious diseases. He wished, however, to add practical demonstration to his arguments by inoculating himself with the plague. In the middle of the hospital and in the presence of all the sick, he plunged a lancet into the bubo of one of the patients and pricked himself with it in his left side. This act, which was the more courageous, as he afterwards acknowledged that the disease had really all the characteristics of the plague, excited the admiration of the whole army, and ensured to the physician lasting glory with posterity. The general-in-chief formed the resolution of returning to Egypt. The favorable season for landing approached, and he had received advice that the English, united with the Turks, were to attempt one in Lower Egypt. Measures were immediately taken for sending away the sick and provisioning El Arish and Katish. All the posts were drawn back, and in the night of our departure, the brigade that was on service in the trenches gradually evacuated the artillery and only set off themselves the next day, protecting all they had before them and protected in their turn by the cavalry. The invalids, who were 1,800 in number and who had all been wounded by firearms, were placed in the center of the divisions to which they belonged. And as there were no means of transport, all the saddle horses and even all the asses, which the soldiers had in use when they came to Syria to carry water and provisions, served on our return to bear the wounded. But when they arrived at Jaffa, the soldiers, seeing before them the terrible desert and aware of what they must suffer in crossing it without water, began first to complain and then broke out into mutiny. It was on this occasion that General Bonaparte gave up all his horses without even keeping one for his private use. The master of his stables, having had the imprudence to supplicate in favor of the beloved mare of the general, he put himself in such a passion that for the first time in my life I saw him strike a man. In his rage, he went up to him and whipped him across the body. I must here say a few words on an odious imputation made long since against General Bonaparte. I mean the pretended poisoning of the soldiers sick of the plague. It is so contrary to truth that General Bonaparte proposed to poison the unfortunate men that Monsieur Larrey, first surgeon to the army, never ceased to pronounce it as an atrocious calumny, and he several times in the last 15 years pressed Monsieur Desgenets to declare publicly with him the fact through the medium of the press. The latter, having been ill-used by the king's government, recoiled probably at the thought of a declaration which might make his situation still more painful. It is besides impossible to name any person to whom the proposal should have been made. Finally, the calumny was spread by the English while they were in Egypt, and propagated by writing of Sir Robert Wilson, who was then extremely young, and who in mature age has openly declared that he had been mistaken. When in our return from St. John of Acre we stopped at Jaffa, where the plague had ceased its ravages, I received from the general-in-chief an order to go through the numerous gardens that surrounded the town, and where a sort of lazaretto had been established for the sick, that we might take along with us all that were not too ill to follow the army. I found 5 or 6 poor soldiers lying beneath the trees. When they saw me, they cried out, "Pray, Commander, take us with you. We are still able to bear the march." I replied, "Try to get up, endeavor to walk." But all the symptoms of the plague were already evident. Not one of them could rise, and I was obliged to leave them, for no soldier would have lent them his aid. I went and made my report to General Bonaparte, who was walking on the seashore. He listened to me without stopping, and we came up to a young horseman who asked also to be taken with us, and who succeeded in rising from the ground. The general, touched with compassion, ordered one of his guides to give his horse to the poor sick man. Neither the authority of the general nor the fear of punishment was sufficient to enforce obedience. The colonel of the guides was obliged to go up to him and promise him in a whisper a great deal of money, which motive was the only one by which he was brought to a decision, and even the colonel was forced to use the greatest vigilance, lest the sick man should be thrown from his horse. I believe he remained at El Arish, and I do not know what became of him. As for the poor soldiers I mentioned, it is to be hoped they died in the course of the night, or at least the following day, so as to have escaped from the cruel death the Arabs prepared for all those who fell into their hands. I feel no remorse for my conduct on that occasion. All I had seen of the plague at Alexandria had convinced me that it is a fatal humanity that induces people to come in contact with the infected when they are once arrived at the last stage of the disease. Nevertheless, I cannot think of those unfortunate men without pain, and if it had been possible to save them, I would have done it.